I was written out of my parents' inheritance in favor of my brother, so I stopped sending money to my parents and helping them. Now they're chasing me and demanding that I come back. So here's the thing about family. You think you know where you stand until life decides to drop a nuclear bomb on everything you believed. My name's Kevin, and I'm 32 years old, living in suburban Ohio, working as an insurance adjuster. Nothing fancy, but it pays the bills and then some. For the past 8 years, I've been the guy my parents called whenever they needed help with anything financial. Computer acting up? Call Kevin. Need help figuring out their retirement portfolio? Call Kevin. Can't understand why their property taxes went up? You guessed it, call Kevin. My brother Ryan, on the other hand, has been living his best life, collecting vintage motorcycles and working part-time at some artisanal coffee shop downtown. The guy's 29 and still act like he's fresh out of college. But hey, I never minded being the responsible one. That's just how our family dynamic worked, right? Mom and Dad raised us differently. I got the work hard and save your money speech, while Ryan got the follow your dreams treatment. I figured they just had different expectations for each of us. Last month, my parents asked me to help them update their life insurance policies. Nothing unusual there. I'd helped them with this stuff before. They want to make sure everything was in order, beneficiaries updated, all that responsible adult stuff. So I'm sitting at their kitchen table, the same one where I used to do homework 20 years ago, going through all their paperwork with Mom hovering over my shoulder, offering me sandwiches every 5 minutes. That's when I found the folder. It was tucked between some old tax returns and their homeowner's insurance documents. The tab read Will and Estate Planning, in Dad's careful handwriting. I wasn't snooping. Honestly, it was right there in the pile of documents they'd given me to organize. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it up. What I saw made my stomach drop faster than a roller coaster at Cedar Point. Every single asset they owned, the house I'd helped them buy, their savings accounts, their investment portfolio, even Mom's jewelry. Everything was going to Ryan, not split between us. Not even a token amount for me. Everything. To Ryan. I sat there staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. This had to be some kind of mistake, right? Maybe it was an old version from before I was born, or something equally ridiculous. But no, the date was from just 6 months ago. 6 months after I'd helped them refinance their mortgage to get a better rate. 6 months after I'd spent my weekend helping Dad install new gutters on their house. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was sitting there, literally managing their financial affairs like some unpaid family accountant, they had already decided that my brother, who couldn't balance a checkbook if his life depended on it, deserved everything they'd worked for. The same brother who'd borrowed $3,000 from them last year to buy some vintage Harley that he just had to have and still hadn't paid back. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe they figured I was doing well enough on my own and didn't need their help. Maybe they thought Ryan needed more support. But the more I thought about it, the more it stung. This wasn't about need. This was about value. And apparently, my value to them was purely functional. Mom walked back into the kitchen just as I was closing the folder. She took one look at my face and knew immediately that something was wrong. The color drained from her cheeks when she saw what I was holding. For a moment, we just stared at each other in complete silence. Then she started stammering something about how they'd been meaning to talk to me about their estate planning, how it wasn't what it looked like, how they valued everything I did for them. But it was exactly what it looked like. While I'd been playing the role of the dutiful son, handling their paperwork, fixing their problems, and basically serving as their personal financial advisor, they'd been planning to leave me with nothing. Not even a family photo, or Dad's old watch. Nothing. Dad came in from the garage at that moment, probably wondering why the house had gotten so quiet. When he saw us frozen there like deer in headlights, he knew the jig was up. The look that passed between my parents was one I'd never seen before. Pure panic mixed with guilt, and maybe just a hint of annoyance that their secret was out. What hurt most wasn't even the money, though I'd be lying if I said that didn't sting. It was a realization that while I'd been thinking of myself as a responsible son, the one they could count on, they'd been thinking of me as something else entirely. A resource, a service provider, Someone who was successful enough that he didn't need their love translated into inheritance. The worst part? I'd been proud of being the one they turned to. I'd worn it like a badge of honor. My parents always call me when they need help with important stuff. I'd tell my coworkers what an absolute fool I'd been. As I sat there in their kitchen, surrounded by the paperwork I'd been organizing for free, like some kind of unpaid intern, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my place in this family was completely wrong. I wasn't the favorite son who got the responsibility. I was the workhorse who got the work while the favorite got the rewards. And that's when everything changed. You know that moment when you realize you've been living in a completely different reality than everyone else around you? That's exactly where I found myself sitting at my parents' kitchen table, holding their will like it was some kind of smoking gun. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Dad finally broke the tension by clearing his throat and suggesting we all sit down and talk about this like adults. Mom was wringing her hands like she always did when she was nervous, and kept glancing between me and the folder like it might spontaneously combust if she looked at it too hard. What happened next was probably the most honest conversation we'd had in years, and definitely the most painful. I didn't yell or throw a tantrum. That's not really my style. Instead, I just laid out the facts like I was presenting an insurance claim at work. I told them about all the times I dropped everything to help them. The weekend I spent teaching Dad how to use online banking, so he wouldn't have to drive to the branch every time he wanted to check his balance. The hours I'd spent on the phone with their credit card company when they got hit with fraudulent charges. The time I'd taken a personal day to sit in their living room while the cable guy fixed their internet because they were afraid he'd try to upsell them on services they didn't need. Mom kept trying to interrupt with explanations about how much they appreciated everything I did, but I held up my hand and kept going. I told them about helping them understand their Medicare options, researching the best deals on their homeowner's insurance, and even driving them to medical appointments when Dad's arthritis was acting up and he couldn't drive himself. Then I asked them the obvious question. If they valued all this help so much, why did they make it seem like I didn't exist? That's when Mom dropped the bomb. That really set me off. She looked at me with those sad puppy dog eyes she perfected over the years and explained that they'd always seen me as the successful one, the one who had his life together. Ryan, on the other hand, was their baby who needed looking after. The way she said it made my blood boil, like being responsible and having my stuff together was some kind of punishment instead of something they should be proud of. Like all those years of making good choices and building a stable life had somehow disqualified me from being their son, who deserved to be taken care of too. Dad chimed in with his own version of the same garbage. He said they knew I'd be fine no matter what happened, that I was strong enough to take care of myself. Ryan needed their help. Ryan needed the security of knowing he'd have something to fall back on. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Ryan needed security? The same Ryan who'd blown through his college fund on a motorcycle and a trip to Europe before he'd even finished his sophomore year? The same Ryan who'd called me crying 3 years ago because he'd gotten fired from his job at the bike shop for showing up late too many times. And could I maybe help him out with rent money? But here's what really got to me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what the money represented. In their minds, everything they'd worked for should go to the child who couldn't take care of himself, while the child who'd spent years taking care of them deserved nothing but the privilege of continuing to solve their problems for free. I tried to explain this to them, but they just didn't get it. Mom kept repeating that they loved us both equally, as if that made everything okay. Dad kept insisting that they'd always planned to talk to me about it. They just hadn't found the right time. What really sealed the deal was when Mom suggested that maybe they could add a small amount for me, maybe $5,000 or $10,000, just to make things more fair, like throwing me a tip for 8 years of unpaid financial services. That's when I realized that arguing with them was pointless. They fundamentally didn't understand what they'd done wrong, and they probably never would, in their minds. They were being practical. Give the money to the kid who needs it. Rely on the other kid to keep helping out of the goodness of his heart. I stood up from the table and started gathering up all their paperwork. Every insurance document, every bank statement, every piece of financial information I've been organizing for them. I stacked it all up in a neat pile and pushed it across the table. Then I told them something I'd never said before in my entire life. I told them that I was done. Done being their unpaid accountant. Done being the son who existed only to solve problems. Done pretending that our relationship was anything more than transactional. I explained that if Ryan was the son who deserved their legacy, then Ryan could also be the son who earned it. Starting immediately, any financial question, any insurance problem, any complicated adult task they needed help with, they could call their favorite son. You should have seen the panic in their eyes when that sunk in. Suddenly, they realized that cutting me out of the will might have some immediate consequences they hadn't considered. Who was going to help Dad figure out why his Social Security check was late? Who was going to call the insurance company when Mom's prescription coverage got messed up? They started backpedaling fast, insisting that they'd never meant for me to stop helping them, that the will was just about money and had nothing to do with our relationship. But that's exactly the problem. They'd separated the two things in their minds when they were actually the same thing. Dad tried to get authoritative, using that voice he'd used when I was a teenager and he wanted to end an argument. He reminded me that family takes care of family, regardless of wills or money or any of that stuff. That's what good sons do. I looked him right in the eye and told him he was absolutely right. Family does take care of family. The problem was they just spent the last hour explaining to me that I wasn't really family. I was just a hired help who happened to share their DNA. Mom started crying at that point, which normally would have made me cave immediately. I've always been a sucker for Mom's tears. But this time, something was different. This time, her tears felt manipulative rather than genuine, like she was crying because her plan had blown up, not because she was sorry for hurting me. I told them both that I needed some time to think about things, and that maybe they should use that time to figure out how they really felt about having two sons instead of one son and one employee. Then I walked out of their house, got in my car, and drove home. I didn't slam the door or screech out of the driveway or any of that dramatic stuff you see in movies. I just left quietly, like I was heading home after any other ordinary visit. But as I was backing out of their driveway, I could see them both standing in the window watching me go. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel guilty about leaving them to figure something out on their own. It felt like freedom. The first week after our kitchen table showdown was honestly the most peaceful week I'd had in years. No random phone calls asking me to explain why their cable bill went up by $3. No emergency visits to help them set up their new smart TV. No frantic texts about suspicious charges on their credit card that turned out to be their monthly Netflix subscription. For the first time in almost a decade, my evenings belonged to me. I actually watched an entire movie without pausing it to walk my dad through logging into his email account. I went out for drinks with my coworkers on Thursday night, instead of rushing over to help my parents understand some medical bill that was written in perfectly plain English. It was weird how quiet my phone was. Usually, I get at least 3 or 4 calls a week from them about something. Now, nothing. Complete radio silence. At first, I wondered if maybe they were giving me the space I'd asked for, or if they were actually trying to handle their own affairs for once. I should have known better. My parents aren't the type to quietly reflect on their mistakes and come up with a mature plan for moving forward. They're more the type to let problems pile up until they reach crisis level, then panic and start making demands. The first crack in their silent treatment came exactly 9 days after I'd walked out. Dad called me at work, which he never did unless it was some kind of emergency. I let it go to voicemail, figuring if it was a real emergency, he'd call back or text me the details. The voicemail was classic Dad. No explanation of what was wrong, just an order disguised as a request. He needed me to call him back as soon as possible to help him with something important. No details, no context, just the assumption that I'd drop whatever I was doing and call him back immediately. I deleted the voicemail and went back to work. 3 hours later, Mom called, then Dad called again. Then Mom texted. By the end of the workday, I had 7 missed calls and 4 increasingly frantic text messages. The texts were particularly interesting. They started out casual, just asking me to give them a call when I had a chance. But as the day went on, they got more demanding. The last one was Mom telling me that they really needed to talk to me about something urgent, and it was important that I call them back tonight. I didn't call them back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. This seemed to break something in their brains, because suddenly the floodgates opened. My phone started buzzing constantly with calls and messages. They weren't asking for help anymore. They were demanding it. Apparently, their mortgage payment was due, and they couldn't figure out how to make the payment online. The system wasn't accepting Dad's password, and when he tried to reset it, he couldn't remember the security question answers. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a 15-minute fix. I would have driven over, helped Dad reset his password, walked him through the payment process, and probably set up automatic payments so it wouldn't happen again. But these weren't normal circumstances anymore. Instead, I texted back a helpful suggestion. Maybe they should call the bank's customer service line or visit a branch in person. You know, like people did before I became their personal IT support department. This response apparently qualified as abandoning my family in their time of need, because the next message I got was a full paragraph about how disappointed they were in my selfishness and how they'd raised me better than this. The mortgage drama was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the calls and messages escalated into a perfect storm of technological helplessness. Their internet went out, and they couldn't figure out how to call the cable company because the phone number was saved in their contacts on their tablet, which couldn't connect to the internet. Their printer stopped working, and they had important documents they needed to print for a doctor's appointment. Each problem came with increasingly dramatic messages about how they were stuck and couldn't function without my help. It was like they'd forgotten how to be adults who could solve their own problems. The breaking point came when Mom called me 6 times in a row while I was in a meeting at work. When I finally listened to the voicemails, she was practically in tears because their credit card had been declined at the grocery store, and she was convinced they'd been hacked or their identity had been stolen. I almost caved at that point. Almost. Because nobody wants their mom crying in the middle of a Kroger because she can't buy groceries. But then I remembered something. Dad had mentioned a week before that they were thinking about getting a new refrigerator. A fancy one with all the bells and whistles that cost more than my car payment. So I called the credit card company myself, not to fix their problem, but to check on something. Sure enough, they'd maxed out their credit limit buying that refrigerator. The card wasn't hacked. They just couldn't do basic math. Instead of calling them back with this information, I sent a text suggesting they call the credit card company to check on their available balance. I didn't explain that I'd already figured out the problem, and I didn't offer to help them understand their statement. I just gave them the customer service number and wished them luck. That's when the messages got really interesting. Suddenly, it wasn't just about needing help with technology or banking. Now I was being accused of abandoning my family, of being selfish and ungrateful, of forgetting everything they'd done for me over the years. The irony was incredible. They were mad at me for not helping them, but they'd already decided I wasn't worth including in their estate planning. They wanted me to keep acting like their son when it came to solving their problems, but they'd made it clear I wasn't really their son when it came to sharing their assets. The guilt trip messages came fast and heavy. Mom sent long texts about how hurt and confused they were, how they'd always been there for me and couldn't understand why I was treating them this way. Dad left voicemails about family obligations and responsibilities, and how real men don't abandon their parents over money. But here's the thing they didn't seem to understand. This was never about the money. This was about respect, about being valued for who I was, not just what I could do for them, about being treated like a son instead of like a service provider who happened to be related to them. By the end of the second week, I'd received 43 phone calls, 27 text messages, and 2 emails about various crises that apparently couldn't be solved without my immediate intervention. Everything from a suspicious letter from the IRS, which turned out to be their annual tax summary, to a strange charge on their bank statement, their monthly gym membership, which they'd had for 3 years. Each message was designed to make me feel guilty for not rushing over to save them from whatever minor inconvenience they were facing. And I'll admit it was working a little bit. Not because I felt bad about my decision, but because it was exhausting to constantly ignore their attempts to drag me back into my old role. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about them needing help. This was about them testing my resolve. They were throwing every crisis they could think of at me to see if I'd crack and come running back with my wallet and my problem-solving skills. But I wasn't going to crack. Not this time. because for the first time in years, I was finally seeing our relationship clearly, without all the guilt and manipulation clouding my judgment. And what I saw wasn't pretty. When direct guilt trips didn't work, my parents decided it was time to bring in the big guns. And by big guns, I mean every single relative who'd ever changed my diaper or bought me a Christmas present. Apparently, when you can't manipulate your own son into submission, the next logical step is to recruit the entire extended family to do it for you. It started with my Aunt Linda, who called me on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner. Linda's always been the family diplomat, the one who smooths over arguments at Thanksgiving and makes sure everyone plays nice at weddings. So when she called, I figured it was probably about my cousin's baby shower or something equally harmless. Instead, she launched into this whole speech about how worried she was about me and my parents. She'd heard there was some kind of misunderstanding, and she just wanted to make sure everyone was okay. The way she said misunderstanding made it clear that my parents had given her their version of events, and their version apparently cast them as confused elderly victims and me as an ungrateful son who'd abandoned them over some silly paperwork. I tried to explain my side of the story, but Linda kept interrupting with things like how my parents were getting older and needed more support, not less. How family disagreements weren't worth destroying relationships over. How I should be the bigger person and reach out to them first. The conversation was frustrating, but I could handle Aunt Linda. What I couldn't handle was a phone tree that apparently activated immediately after our call ended. Within 24 hours, I'd heard from Uncle Bob, Cousin Jennifer, my dad's brother Frank, and even my great-aunt Martha, who's 93 years old and usually can't figure out how to answer a phone. Each conversation followed the same basic script. They were calling because they were concerned about this rift in the family. They'd heard that there had been some kind of argument about money, and they thought maybe I was overreacting. They were sure that if I just talked to my parents, we could work everything out. The most annoying part was how they all made it sound like I was the problem. Nobody seemed interested in hearing about 8 years of unpaid financial services, or about how it felt to discover that your parents had written you out of their will, while you were literally sitting at their kitchen table organizing their estate planning documents. Instead, I kept getting lectures about forgiveness and family loyalty, about how parents aren't perfect, and sometimes they make mistakes, but that doesn't mean you should hold grudges, about how I was lucky to have parents who were still alive and healthy, and I shouldn't take that for granted. Uncle Bob was probably the worst. He called me on my lunch break and spent 15 minutes telling me about how his dad had died when he was young, and how he'd give anything to have one more conversation with him. The implication was clear. I was being petty and selfish by refusing to talk to my parents over something as trivial as inheritance planning. When I tried to explain that this wasn't really about money, Bob cut me off and told me that everything is about money when you're fighting about wills. He said I should be ashamed of myself for caring more about getting my fair share than about maintaining a relationship with my parents. The family pressure campaign reached its peak when my parents decided to escalate to what I like to call public shaming warfare. They started showing up places where they knew I'd be, looking sad and pathetic, and hoping someone would ask them why they seemed so upset. First, it was a grocery store where I usually shop on Saturday mornings. I rounded the corner into the cereal aisle, and there was Mom dramatically sighing while she compared prices on oatmeal. When she saw me, her face lit up like she just spotted a life preserver in the middle of the ocean. She rushed over and started talking about how much she'd miss me, how empty the house felt without me coming over to help with things. She was speaking just loudly enough that other shoppers could hear, and I could see people glancing over with that, isn't that sweet look that people get when they think they're witnessing a heartwarming family reunion. What they were actually witnessing was a carefully orchestrated guilt trip, complete with Mom mentioning how Dad had been so stressed about their financial situation that he'd barely been sleeping, how they tried calling the bank for help, but the customer service people were so rude and impatient, how they just didn't understand all this computer stuff like I did. I kept the conversation short and polite, but I didn't take the bait. I told her I hoped they figured out their banking issues, and excused myself to finish my shopping. As I walked away, I could hear her telling another customer how kids these days just don't care about family the way they used to. The grocery store ambush was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, they managed to accidentally run into me at the gas station, the library, and my favorite restaurant. Each time, the performance got a little more dramatic and a little more public. The restaurant incident was particularly mortifying. I was having dinner with a coworker when Dad suddenly appeared at our table, looking like he'd aged 10 years since I'd last seen him. He made a big show of being surprised to see me there, then launched into this whole thing about how he'd been trying to reach me about some important financial documents that needed my attention. My co-worker was looking back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match, clearly picking up on the tension, but not understanding what was happening. Dad kept talking about how much they needed my help, how lost they were without me, how they'd always depended on me to handle the complicated stuff. The whole performance was designed to make me look like a heartless son who was abandoning his elderly parents in their time of need. And it was working. I could see the judgment in my co-worker's eyes, the way she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about my character. That's when I realized that my parents weren't just trying to guilt me into coming back. They were actively trying to damage my reputation, to turn people against me by controlling the narrative about our family conflict. They were banking on the fact that most people would automatically side with elderly parents over their adult child, especially when the parents look helpless and the child looks successful. The campaign reached its absolute lowest point when they somehow got my boss's phone number and called to express their concern about how stress was affecting my work performance. They told him they were worried about me, that I'd been acting strange lately, and they thought maybe I was having some kind of breakdown. My boss called me into his office the next day to ask if everything was okay at home and whether I needed any time off to deal with family issues. It was humiliating but also clarifying. My parents were willing to potentially damage my career in order to manipulate me into resuming my role as their unpaid financial advisor. That night, I sat down and wrote a group email to every family member who called to lecture me about forgiveness and family loyalty. I laid out the whole story. The years of free financial help, the will that excluded me entirely, the explanation that I didn't deserve inheritance because I was too successful to need their help. I explained that this wasn't about money. It was about respect and reciprocity. That I wasn't abandoning my parents. I was just refusing to continue a one-sided relationship where I provided all the support and they provided all the criticism. Most of the family members didn't respond to my email, which told me everything I needed to know about whose side they'd chosen. But a few did respond, and their messages were eye-opening. Cousin Jennifer admitted that she'd always thought it was unfair how much my parents relied on me compared to Ryan. Uncle Frank said he'd had no idea how much financial help I'd been providing over the years. The family pressure campaign wasn't working the way my parents had hoped, but unfortunately for me, they weren't ready to give up yet. They were just getting started, and their next move was going to force me to make a choice that would change everything. My grandmother's 80th birthday party was supposed to be a celebration, but I knew it was going to be a battlefield. Grandma Rose had been planning this party for months. The whole extended family coming together at the community center, complete with a slideshow of old family photos and her famous chocolate cake recipe that nobody else could ever get quite right. Under normal circumstances, I would have been looking forward to it. Grandma Rose has always been my favorite person in our family. Tough as nails, but fair, and she never played favorites or got involved in family drama. But these weren't normal circumstances, and I knew my parents were planning to use this gathering as their final attempt to publicly shame me into submission. I almost didn't go. I spent the entire morning of the party trying to convince myself that I could skip it and just visit Grandma separately later. But that felt like letting my parents win, like admitting that their manipulation tactics were working. Plus, I genuinely wanted to celebrate Grandma Rose, and I wasn't going to let my parents' dysfunction rob me of that experience. So I showed up, brought a nice gift, and prepared myself for whatever drama was about to unfold. The community center was packed with relatives I hadn't seen in years, kids running around between tables, and the unmistakable smell of potluck dinner and cheap coffee. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. I made small talk with cousins, admired pictures of new babies, and helped Grandma Rose blow out her candles. My parents were there, of course, but they kept their distance and stuck to looking sad and wounded whenever they thought someone was watching. The trouble started during the toast portion of the evening, when family members were invited to share memories and well wishes for Grandma Rose. Uncle Frank went first, telling a funny story about how Grandma had taught him to change a tire when he was 16. Cousin Jennifer shared a sweet memory about how Grandma always remembered everyone's birthday without writing them down anywhere. Then Dad stood up with his glass of punch, and I knew immediately that this wasn't going to be about Grandma Rose at all. He started off innocent enough, talking about how Grandma had always been a heart of our family, how she taught all of us the importance of sticking together through thick and thin, how family was the most important thing in life, and how lucky we all were to have each other. But then his tone shifted, and he started talking about how disappointed Grandma would be if she knew that some family members were letting petty disagreements tear apart the relationships she'd worked so hard to build. How some people seem to think that money was more important than family bonds. The room got uncomfortably quiet. Everyone could tell that this wasn't really a toast to Grandma Rose anymore. This was Dad using her birthday party as a platform to call me out in front of the entire extended family. I could see people glancing between me and Dad, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when something inside me snapped. I'd spent weeks listening to lectures about family loyalty and forgiveness, weeks being painted as the ungrateful son who'd abandoned his elderly parents over money. I'd watched my parents manipulate relatives, ambush me in public places, and even contact my boss in their desperate attempts to force me back into my old role. I stood up before Dad could finish his speech, and I raised my own glass. The room went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. I started by saying how much I loved Grandma Rose, and how grateful I was that she'd always treated all her grandchildren with equal love and respect, how she'd never played favorites or made anyone feel like they had to earn their place in the family, how she'd always been someone you could count on to tell you the truth, even when it wasn't what you wanted to hear. Then I looked directly at my parents and said that Grandma had also taught me the importance of standing up for yourself when people try to take advantage of your kindness, how she'd always said that respect is a two-way street, and that love without respect isn't really love at all. I told the room about the 8 years I'd spent as my parents' unpaid financial advisor, dropping everything whenever they needed help with banking, insurance, taxes, or any other adult responsibility they didn't want to handle themselves. I explained how I discovered their will while helping them with their life insurance, and how it had excluded me entirely while leaving everything to my brother, who'd never lifted a finger to help them. The shocked looks on people's faces were priceless. Aunt Linda's jaw literally dropped. Uncle Bob started shaking his head, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Even some of my younger cousins were looking at my parents with expressions of complete disbelief. But I wasn't done yet. I told them about my parents' explanation, that I didn't need their inheritance because I was successful enough to take care of myself, while Ryan needed their help because he wasn't as capable. How they'd essentially admitted that they saw me as a resource rather than as a son deserving of equal treatment. I explained that I wasn't angry about not inheriting their money. I was hurt by what their decision revealed about how they viewed our relationship, how they expected me to continue providing free services while planning to give everything to the son who provided nothing. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. People were staring at my parents with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. Dad's face was red with embarrassment and anger, while Mom looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. That's when Uncle Frank, Dad's own brother, stood up and said something that shocked everyone, including me. He said that he'd always wondered why I was the one who handled everything for my parents, while Ryan got to coast through life without any responsibilities. He said it had never seemed fair to him, and now he understood why. Frank looked directly at Dad and said that if he treated his own sons the way Dad had treated his, he'd expect the responsible one to walk away too. He said that parents who take their children's help for granted and then reward the child who doesn't help are sending a pretty clear message about what they value. Other family members started nodding in agreement. Cousin Jennifer said she'd always thought it was weird how much my parents depended on me for everything. Aunt Martha said that in her day, parents left their estates to the children who'd been there for them, not the ones who'd been absent. My parents tried to defend themselves, but it was too late. The narrative they'd been carefully constructing, where they were the innocent victims and I was the ungrateful son, had completely fallen apart. Instead, they looked like manipulative people who'd been using their son's sense of duty against him for years. Ryan, who had been notably quiet throughout this whole exchange, finally spoke up. He said he'd had no idea that our parents had excluded me from their will, and that he thought it was messed up. He admitted that he'd always felt guilty about how much more help I gave them compared to him, but he'd figured that was just how our family worked. Then Ryan said something that really surprised me. He told our parents that he didn't want their inheritance if it came at the cost of losing his relationship with me. He said they needed to figure out how to treat both their sons fairly, or they might end up losing both of them. The party pretty much ended after that. People started making excuses and gathering up their kids, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama that had exploded in the middle of Grandma Rose's celebration. I felt terrible about ruining her special day, but she pulled me aside before I left and told me she was proud of me for standing up for myself. She said that sometimes the truth needs to come out, even when it's uncomfortable, and that maybe this was exactly what needed to happen for our family to start healing. She also said that my parents had been foolish to take my help for granted, and that she hoped they'd learn something from this experience. Over the next few weeks, things slowly started to change. My parents called me, and for the first time, they actually apologized instead of trying to justify their actions. They said they'd never realized how their decisions had made me feel, and that they wanted to make things right. They didn't change their will immediately. That took several months of family therapy sessions that Ryan insisted we all attend. But eventually, they updated it to split everything equally between us. More importantly, they stopped treating me like their personal assistant and started treating me like their son again. Ryan stepped up too. He started handling more of the day-to-day help that our parents needed, and he paid back the money he'd borrowed from them. Our relationship got stronger because of all this. We'd finally found a balance where both of us were contributing instead of me carrying all the weight. It's been 2 years since that birthday party, and our family dynamic is completely different now. Better, but different. My parents ask for help sometimes, but they also ask Ryan, and they don't assume that either of us will drop everything to solve their problems. They've learned to handle more things on their own, and when they do need help, they ask nicely instead of demanding. Most importantly, I finally feel like I'm valued for who I am, not just what I can do, and that's made all the difference in the world. So there you have it, the story of how I went from being my parents' unpaid financial advisor to being their son again. It wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't pretty, but sometimes you have to be willing to lose a relationship in order to save it. Sometimes standing up for yourself is the most loving thing you can do, even when it doesn't feel that way at the time. Thanks for sticking with me through this whole crazy story. I know it was a lot, but I really wanted to share what I learned about family dynamics and standing up for yourself, even when it's really hard. What do you think about how I handled this situation? Did I do the right thing, or should I have tried a different approach? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, or if you've been through something similar with your own family, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Your support really means a lot to me, and it helps me keep sharing these personal stories that hopefully help other people who might be going through similar situations. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.